afternoon, everyone. I think we need to get those biological companies to develop products for humans. As a speaker, this time of the year, I just live in fear of getting a cold and calling Ken the night before and saying, Ken, I can't be there tomorrow. I got to come anyway. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the second year of my tomato variety research. Actually, I'm going to combine the two. The reason we do trials for 2 years is the reason you're going to see exactly why in a moment, why we do trials for 2 years. I just want to go ahead and mention.
Job security?
No, not job security. I just want to mention, though, earlier on, if you were in here, you saw that video. I want to mention that this is research that has been supported by the Pennsylvania Vegetable Marketing and Research Board, so appreciate their support. This would not have happened if it wasn't for that sort of support. So, tomatoes. Always a good crowd for tomatoes, a very popular crop. So I'm going to start by what I did, and then we'll talk about what I found. So the first year, 2016, I had 23 varieties of tomatoes, and then I had 6 advanced selections from Dr. Majid Falad's program at Penn State. Standard procedure of production, plasticulture, and drip. Planted 18 inches in row on a wide bed. There were 4 10-plant reps, so I harvested 10 plants, and the numbers were from that, so a total of 40 per variety, except for the Penn State varieties. Those were either 1 or 2 reps. I didn't get as much seed from Dr. Falad. Followed standard fertility and pest management. I always say, read the production guide, and that's what I did. No foliar fertilizers, and I put this in here because as you talk to tomato growers, there's, at least in Lancaster, they like to spray a lot of things. I don't know if that's in other parts of the state or other states, but my growers are always trying to spray something on their tomatoes. That, to me, kind of mixes or muddies the water, so I put that in there. And we suckered them up. The first year, I suckered them up to 3 below the first flower cluster. They were seeded on the 26th of April and planted out May 31st. Started harvest on August the 1st. Through September the 9th, we harvested 2 times a week. I grade them into number 1s, number 2s, and culls. Everything is counted and weighed. And as Ken had asked, is there tasting? And that's always a challenge. I always get that question, which ones taste the best? Certainly as tomato growers, that's what your clients are asking probably, or if you have a roadside market, which ones taste the best? Informal tasting. There's a lot of tomatoes come in, and there's a challenge there in first is what is an objective way to taste a tomato. The kind of tomato I would like wouldn't be what you might like. Some like them sweet, some like them a little more acid. I always like to talk about apples. My wife loves red, delicious apples. I think I'd rather chew on a cardboard box. But there are some really good apples. So, and I think tomatoes, some people like a sweeter tomato, some of them like them more acidic. So to say that this was the best tasting tomato, well, it was the best tasting to me. So I'm just going to put that out there that there were no consistent differences. The other thing is you grab one tomato from a basket, and again, as a tomato grower, you cut one, well, this one's really bad. What does the next one look like? So we're just going to go ahead and dispense with that. That's something for you to follow up on your farm. And to mention, 2016 was a dry year with high temperatures for us. We had a dry summer. We keep talking bacterial disease. And the bacterial disease started up in the northwest corner of my trial that year. And I was just figuring, here goes the trial, because that's the predominant wind corner, and the rain stopped. And we didn't have any rain until after the trial, essentially. So had some fruit quality issues, though. I never quite got the irrigation straightened out in 2016. So we'll come back to that. So let's see here. There, 2017. People heard I was doing a tomato trial. I ended up with 32 varieties. Don't do this at home. Way too many to really evaluate well, essentially. Plus 10 advanced selections from Dr. Falad. Again, same production system. I cut back to 4 6-plant reps. Some four plant reps for the Penn State, standard fertility, pest management, everything else. Except the suckering was a little bit different. We only went to the 1 sucker below that first flower. For some reason, my students had trouble figuring out 3 down, so we just went with the easy way. Those of you that grow tomatoes know that. First sucker is a good strong one. I said take it out to that strong sucker. Seeded April 6th, got them out a little bit earlier, trying to get the fruit harvest before all the students went back to school. Started about a week earlier in terms of harvest, because if you remember this past year, at least for us, it was a cool wet spring, things didn't really grow that well for me. So again, started harvest July the 21st. I carried it through the 9th of September, a little bit longer. Again, same process in terms of 2 harvests, grade 1, 2, and cull. Cool year, then it got warm, but basically it was wet throughout the season, and I had bacteria. Spot probably, I think, is what mostly I had in there. I don't think I had as much speck, and it really hit me hard. You'll see in a moment. And still had issues with the irrigation. This year I think I over-irrigated a little bit because last year it was dry. We put them on a timer this year. That's not the best way to go if you still don't get the timer adjusted. That's one of the challenges of a research farm because the technicians are managing multiple crops and they can't always go back and did you turn the irrigation off because it rained? Well, no. So the way I'm going to present this data, Mountain Fresh is going to be my standard. We're probably transitioning out of that, but I'm figuring everyone's familiar with that. So this is per plant. So in 2016, I had about 10 number 1 fruits that weighed 6.5 pounds per plant, 9 number 2s that weighed 5.6 pounds. That's how you'll see this data. And I figure that's easiest. Depending on how you plant, you can go with the number of plants you have. And in 2016, and the light color here means that variety was only in there for 1 year. So these were a couple of numbered selections. And you should recognize some of these. 589 is one we like for the flavor. Everyone says that that's a good one, but the yields weren't up to Mountain Fresh in this particular year. And none of them really were close to that in this first slide. You can see there's an experimental here, was closer, but nothing was quite there. And this is why we do trials for 2 years. This was 2017. What do you see on that trial? Okay, 2016, 2017. I often will remark, it's a good thing I'm not doing this for a living. But you can see the yields were way down. But what stood out here, a couple of them, Primo Red came on well last year. I don't know if it's because it was an early variety and before it was totally destroyed, if you will, by the bacteria, that I got the yields off of there. But Grand Marshal was one that was a new one. I had heard some good things about that since then. I only saw it for 1 year. But overall, just horrible yields for me. But you know, Mountain Fresh was still better than this first group overall here. And then if you go back then to 2016, so here's your total marketable weight. So I had about 12 pounds in 2016. Average fruit size, so about 0.6 of a pound. There were a couple of them that were larger here, the Mountain Majesty Primo Red. Total harvestable weight was higher in some of these other ones, but basically that's going to mean there were more culls, so that's not a good thing. To me, this is where you want to see the higher yields. And in this particular first one, you can see here about 80% pack out on the Mountain Fresh in 2016. Everything else in this first group was below that. Moving on to 2017, my pack out was 42%, 5 pounds marketable fruit. Total, you can see, very high amount of cull. So this was splits, and this was bacteria that was on there. Again, the Grand Marshal was a little bit higher pack out. Did a little bit better in terms of total yields there, but still, these aren't kind of the numbers that are going to keep folks in farming. But this is what I found. Primo Red did well this year. Again, that was the total marketable. So fruit size in all of these was generally good. I like to see a half a pound fruit. So back to 2016, the second group of fruit. Raleigh was one that was only there for 1 year. Red Morning and Red Mountain are some names I've heard mentioned. Red Deuce is probably becoming a standard now, if I were to say in our area and in talking with other growers. In the first year, it did not do as well, here as you can see, but Red Morning and Red Mountain were two that did well. Red Bounty in 2017 did well. Here's Red Morning and Red Mountain. Again, Red Deuce didn't do quite so well, but very similar to Mountain Fresh there. But these were two that looked pretty good. And I was talking with some of the folks in the trade show, and they say, yeah, if it wasn't for the large size fruit in Red Deuce, then this might be the varieties that would replace that with. So that would be something, if you haven't looked at one of those two, that might be something for you to go ahead and look at. Back to 2016, again, you can see the pack out was good there. Good size in the Red Morning, almost an 0.8 pound. Didn't quite, none of those in 2016 packed out quite as high as the Mountain Fresh, But these numbers here are fairly respectable overall. Looking at 2017, again, but here's Red Mountain actually did well in terms of the pack out, about 10 pounds of marketable fruit. So that was a little bit closer, again, versus 5 pounds for the Mountain Fresh. And here's the Red Morning. So those varieties for me did well. I just want to point out here, almost 8/10 of a pound fruit. In the first season, we were pulling 1 pound fruit off of there in Red Deuce, which I wonder if we're not getting a little bit too big depending on your market. But again, these, I would have to say, of what I was seeing out of this group, Red Morning, Red Mountain would be two that certainly, if you haven't grown those might be worth looking at. Moving on to the next group, Rocky Top is probably one that our growers like, some for the high tunnels. The claim is that it has better flavor. Certain growers like to see that. The yields were similar here to the Mountain Fresh. Scarlet Red was one we used to grow, but that one's fading. This STM 8005, I have that highlighted because that was discontinued by the company. We'll see it came back this year. It does well in Pennsylvania. It looked good, but it only does well in Pennsylvania, talking with Cicada, so they're dropping that. And 2016 Volante was one that did well. Volante did well again in 2017. You can see here this STM variety was similar to the Mountain Fresh. Here's one of the Rutgers varieties in there, had a larger number of number ones, but the weight was pretty good. I'll come back to that Rutgers 250. Had some selections out of Rutgers this year. They have a breeding program. This was one they released for their 250th anniversary, and it did well in terms of number one fruit. Going back to 2016 again, here's that STM variety, which doesn't exist, so I'm not going to spend time with it. Volante looked fairly good. Here's the STM, had good pack out there, but again, we might as well ignore that because it's going away. And here's the Rutgers, again, did well this year, Resolute, and then Tribute and Volante. And again, none of them did really well in terms of the pack out. The Rutgers did a little bit better. Tribute, Volante were similar, but those are just kind of miserable numbers as a tomato grower. I see a head shaking down there. I don't know if we're talking about this, but that's just not really good. The other thing here in this one, that's getting down. I don't think anything below a half a pound is really going to make it commercially. Perhaps if you have a roadside stand or if it's a very early variety, but beyond that, you need to be at least in this 6/10, 7/10 of a pound. So some of the experimental ones, or I shouldn't say experimental, they're numbered ones. Here's the Mountain Fresh from this year. So these were just in this year. Tremendous number of number ones there with a really good weight. We'll come back to see what the problem is with that. This is the one RU07, which again did well in terms of the number of number ones and a fairly decent pack out there. This was one from Cicada that did well. And when I had given this presentation earlier, the fellow from Cicada came up and said that this has been named Roadster. So that one, again, saw it for 1 year, but you can see last year it did better than Mountain Fresh. Here's that Rutgers one, and here's the problem. 2/10 of a pound, and we'll see what those fruit were. So I'm thinking right now the Rutgers stuff must be for home gardeners, processors. Well, we'll come back to that in a moment, but you can see the fruit is a little bit smaller in terms of what I think our market would have, and I don't know what your market. Right around that half-pound fruit, that's getting pretty small. Very poor pack out here in this particular one. So nobody here from Rutgers, so I'm going to say I was underwhelmed with the Rutgers selection. And these were the Cicada materials here, and again, this you can see the Roadster. The Mountain Fresh was a little over 11 pounds. And the Cicada materials was 10 and 12. So it looks like there's some better things there, although the pack out was poor here. It was pretty good here overall. Good size fruit here. So that one's to be determined. So looking back at the Penn State materials, and I had mentioned I had 10 this year, but I only went back to the 5 of them that I saw for 2 years. And here in the first year in 2016, the number of number ones and the weight of number ones in 5, 8, and 28 looked very good, much better than the Mountain Fresh. And even though the numbers are down, again, 5, 8, and 28 here in terms of the number of number ones, the weight here in the 15-8 was a little bit better. Overall, they weren't tremendously higher. but Dr. Falad's got some better things in process here. You can see total marketable weight back in 2016 was good for these four with good pack outs. Here was 87%, 84, 74, 79. So he's got some good materials there. Overall, I would say the two that I liked were the 15.8 and the 15.28 were the two that, of those particular lines. I know he is ramping up production of those. I don't know, there's some folks, he said he's going to be doing some more in-field trialing. And then here's 2017, and again, you can see the marketable weights were similar, a little bit better here for the 15H, and the pack-out percentages were still a little bit better. So, got some really good feelings for some of what's coming along from Dr. Falad's program. So, just what was I looking at? In 2016, I was getting these really deep cracks in there, and that was back to uneven watering. It wasn't automated, it was getting dry, then it would get wet, we would have an occasional rain, and you can see this fruit was green and it was just deeply cracked. 2017 still had some of the crackings because we almost overwatered sometime because I put it on a timer, but we didn't get it turned off when it needed to be turned off. I appreciate folks that can grow really good tomatoes. But you can see I had a lot of bacterial diseases, and as the season went on, a lot of those fruit were culled because of bacteria, and I threw everything I knew at that and just never, as Beth said this morning, that is just, and as a grower I know that is just difficult, and I went with what was the best program I could come up with and just never really could slow that down. Now the pictures, you're going to see the same variety 2 years. So this is Mountain Fresh in 2016, and with the heat we were seeing a lot of the yellowing inside there. There was some problems with the yellowing on the outside of the fruit versus 2017 when we had a more temperate year, and that is what tomatoes should look like. So, 2016, it wasn't always easy to see or know what was inside the fruit, but when I was cutting fruit, if I couldn't find one that didn't have the yellow in there, then that's what you're going to see for the picture. Here's Grand Marshal from 2017, and again for 1 year, but that one was one that might be worth looking at again. If I were going to continue, I'd certainly have that in there. Primo Red in 2016 still had a little bit of the yellow in there, but looked really nice here in 2017. Just good color with that. Red Deuce, and I cut, and that was still, there was a lot of that yellow in there, and folks that were taking the tomatoes home were coming back to me. We got a little out in our nutrition that year, but even when we finally got it straightened out, still had that problem with yellow, and I know that becomes an issue in years where you have high temperatures. You get some of that yellow tissue formation in there. But it's partly this clicker here, Andrew. There we are. But Red Deuce here in 2017 looked much nicer, and you can see, just that's a big tomato, but it can really have good color. Red Morning, didn't see as much of the yellow in there in 2016. Here it is in 2017. Red Mountain, again, just very little in there in 16 and here in 2017. So some nice varieties out there. These are getting a little rough on the bottom, but again, that would depend on your market. But here's the RU03, and that was just what was in the basket to give you an idea of the size of those. Now, the bottoms were rough, had some of the yellow in the top. I guess you could sell that as an heirloom. I don't know. But the Master Gardener volunteers that were picking it said, this is great. We'd have small tomatoes for our salads and big. So it's definitely a home garden variety, or their genetics seem to be home variety. I think from a commercial standpoint right now, I don't think he's breeding for the commercial market. But here was the one that, in terms of pack out, looked a little better, but very rough tomato, had a little bit of yellow in it even this year. So I would say that the Rutgers program's not quite there yet. But here's Roadster. I put this in here, a nice dark red, a little rough on the bottom, some of those, but overall it had a nice dark red color and good yields on that variety. You can see not much of the gel in there. There's a lot of solid tomato. Now this was the 15H in 2016, and it had some of the yellow in there. But last year it looked better. The number is different, but that's the same variety. And here's the 1528. This is probably, in terms of what I saw, this was back in 2016. and here it was in 2017. You can see Dr. Flosman selecting for dark red. He wants the minimum of the gel in there, so I think there's some really nice things coming along from Penn State. And that sounds like a plug for the local breeder, but I'm going to go with that. Yeah, this clicker, Andrew, is just... And with that, I'm thinking I'm done probably a little early, so I have time for questions. I didn't see the use in showing all the pictures of other tomatoes, since there were only a few that, in terms of what I saw, that looked like they were consistent year to year. So, questions?
Question.
What did you say?
Nope, need the mic.
What did you say that yellowing was caused by? Too much heat?
It was too much heat. When the temperatures that year were in the 90s, and then as I talked to other growers, they were saying that's just a function of high temperatures. There is some interaction with nutrition, but it is just partly that tomatoes do that when it gets really hot.
Would it be better if you could shade them somehow if it's too hot like that?
That might be a way to go ahead and reduce that, to try and it's going to be cooling the air temperature. It's not the fruit temperature, it's the air temperature. And I don't know, has Jerry Brust is talking somewhere. I don't think he's talking in here. So maybe it's in the high tunnel session. There's a fellow out of Maryland named Jerry Brust.
It's a high tunnels.
Who's been doing some work shading fruit and increasing pack out. So you might want to look for that talk. I don't know if that would be tomorrow or Thursday, and it might be interesting to see what he's finding, because he is shading his small plots. Other questions?
Did you find 2016 different than 2017 with cat faces?
I did not really see much cat facing either year. The question would be 2016, or excuse me, 2017, because the cooler.
This fall, I don't know, this fall seemed to have a lot of cat faces.
Okay, how late into the fall did you carry it?
Pardon me?
How late in the fall?
If you really want to know how late we had tomatoes too?
Well, but the reason I'm asking is because if it was coming on, I was done September the 11th.
I was eating tomatoes for Christmas.
Okay.
We picked tomatoes in November this year.
Well then, as you're picking tomatoes in that time of the year, cat facing is not going to be surprising, because it's a result of cold temperatures. It's cool temperatures tend to cause that in the fruit. So you're going to see as you get...
Some varieties seem to have more cat faces than others.
And there will be some differences.
What do you think? Do you have any idea of what you would recommend, like which one you think had more than the other?
To be honest, I don't think we saw, since we started harvesting July and August, I was not seeing cat facing. I didn't push it on the front end. So I would have to say I did not challenge them for cool temperatures to see the cat facing. So you might want to visit with some of the seed folks over in the trade show. I apologize, but I was right in the middle window, so it was warm through my harvest period, so I did not really see the cat facing.
I just remember Labor Day being the coldest Labor Day I can remember.
Yeah, but I was picking on the 11th, so they weren't developing after that.
Yeah.
So I
in
didn't
his
see
case,
that.
he could still be blooming and holding up. True, but then you're going to have the blossom staying on the end too. Yep. Yep. We call it yellow shoulder in our neck of the woods. Anyone else? Questions for Tim?
One right
Sorry.
behind.
What's the primary difference between a number 1 and number 2, and how do you determine pack out rate?
Okay, the pack out rate was I went and I took total marketable divided by total yield. So even though it was 1 or 2, it was still a saleable fruit. So that was what I was calling percent marketable. So that's what the percent. Yeah, I kicked out the culls. Now that doesn't say, you're not getting the same price. In terms of grading, it wasn't strictly by what USDA standards would be. So for a number 1, you could have maybe a 1/4 inch small crack in the top, but you got any larger than that, and it was graded to a number 2. Any of those really deep cracks automatically became a cull. You looked at the appearance of the fruit, and again, part of that is appearance, but the cracks were the main thing that I was grading for. Some of that shape comes into there. Somewhat, I guess this most similar thing would be USDA grading, maybe a little harder than that. Our markets tend to be, at least in Lancaster with so many tomato growers, they...
Tim, you got to be a little careful. There's a Mr. Ugly tomato out there, so.
Well,
It's
but
been-
that one is marketed as Mr. Ugly.
Right.
These are marketed as fresh market tomatoes.
But it's still USDA grade ugly, right?
So, yeah.
Another question?
Does USDA have any standards as far as heirloom varieties? You know, how do they grade that versus heirloom or fresh market?
I don't think that the heirlooms have a standard. I mean, I could be wrong in that. I don't know. Does anyone correct me?
Any,
Part of that goes
address
to...
that? That's a good question, yeah.
That is a good question.
Anyone in the audience?
Because if I
wanna-
think about it, it's, you don't see cracked tomatoes in the grocery store, but you can see what we would consider misshapen tomatoes under the ugly fruit, as Ken mentioned, some of the others. So I'm thinking at that point, it kind of goes back to what the market will accept. I don't know that I've seen anything written for what we would consider an heirloom or an heirloom type tomato.
If you go. Gentlemen's talking about supply and demand. Yeah, when you don't have many, they'll sell. Yeah.
Any other questions, or am I out of time, Ken?
Nope. You got time for a couple more? If you don't give questions, you got to stand on one of my jokes. So. All right. Yes.
Just kind of curious of what's the difference between the heirloom and the hybrids as far as how soon can you call it an heirloom variety? I think it's a difference in the seed companies and what they,
Well,
and their honesty and so forth, but just wondering what your opinion is on that.
Well, part of that's going to depend on your market. You don't see what I would call true heirlooms necessarily in the grocery store. Things that you might run through a fresh market as heirloom aren't going to probably make it in a grocery store. A lot of times you'll see crack, you'll see the misshapen fruit, you'll see the really scarred bottoms, as I like to call that. So part of that's going to be what will your market accept. The fruit is softer, which makes it really hard to run through a commercial type operation where it's going to be sitting around for a while. Generally, in terms of the varieties, it's an heirloom would be something that's probably more than 25 years old would fall into. It's an age type thing. They have heirloom type tomatoes. If you look in the catalogs now, it's got newer genetics, but they call it heirloom type. I mean, I guess that means that they say it's uglier and not quite as smooth. So it's getting a little muddy in terms of the water, if you will. But I would think for a true heirloom is going to be something more than 25 years old. You can tell usually they have the green shoulders, a little bit of yellowing on there, cracks, rough bottoms.
Also has to do with, is it an open pollinated? Steve, you
And
wanna
open
tackle that one?
pollinate, that's another good point, Ken.
Yeah,
And
that's-
all the heirlooms are OPs that you can save the seed.
So, Tim, I agree with you. The 25 years I've always looked at, it's an open pollinated variety with a good backstory.
Oh, okay.
That's an heirloom.
That goes back to your marketing piece.
Exactly. As long as you can put a good story to it on how it came over from the old country, whatever that old country is, that's an heirloom.
Okay. I knew I was up when I handed him the mic, yes. Okay. There you go. If Grandpa grew it, it's an heirloom. I do remember, just a quick story while we have time. Randy Gardner was sharing about improving heirlooms, and Randy Gardner's a tomato breeder out of North Carolina State. So he's talking about doing cutting one and putting on top of a good rootstock. I said, is that still an heirloom if you're growing it on top of a yeah, it's a good rootstock and put your heirloom on top of it. Is that still an heirloom? And he grinned a little and said, well, call it what you want. So I don't think that's technically an heirloom, but it does have a good backstory, Steve. So, all right, let's give Tim a hand.